Hello, guys. This is my next to last 2022 governor's map prediction or gubernatorial election prediction. I plan on making a 2022 midterm election prediction on November 7th, which is going to be my final governor prediction. So let's get into this. All right, California, Hawaii, not going to be very competitive governor races at all. Massachusetts, Republicans messed up by pretty much backing a very Trump-backed dude. He's too right-wing to win in Massachusetts. Should have stuck with Charlie Baker, and Baker didn't want to run because he thought he would lose the primary. Maryland, same story as Massachusetts. It's just not going to be competitive because of how right-wing the guy is. Illinois, I don't know why people are putting it to a likely margin. Darren Bailey is a terrible candidate, terrible Republican candidate. He's not even moderate. He's not going to win in a blue state like Illinois. In Vermont, New Hampshire, I think these are fairly safe races for the GOP here. I don't think it's going to be that competitive at all. So I think Republicans are going to score victory in both these states with their popular liberal Republicans. In Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota, finally they came out with a poll here. Republicans win easily by like 14 points. Alaska, don't really think it's going to be that competitive. Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina. I mean, there was that point in the debate where the South Carolina governor pretty much came out against gay marriage. Don't really think that's going to hurt him a bit, but it could go to likely, but I don't think it will. I think the Republican will still win here by over 10, just because 2022 is looking like it's a red-leaning midterm. Ohio and Iowa, very popular incumbents. They're really not going to lose here. Mike DeWine's probably going to win by over 20 points. Very large victory for him in this race. In Florida, Ron DeSantis is running against Charlie Crist, and DeSantis is pretty much destroying him in the polls, winning by over 10% in most of them. And I do think DeSantis is probably going to win here by 11 to 12 points against Charlie Crist. And the early voting numbers are looking terrible for Democrats. They're getting outpaced almost in Miami-Dade County, and that county barely went to Biden by like a likely margin. And I think DeSantis might flip that county against Charlie Crist, which is just awful news for Democrats in Florida. It's truly becoming a much more Republican state every year now. It's really trending that way. In Oklahoma, I mean, most polls show it as a likely race. Emerson did a poll here showing the Republican up by about 9. So I'm going to say the Republican wins by about 8 to 9 points against Hoffmeister. However, some polls have shown Hoffmeister up as well. So keep an eye on Oklahoma. It might be a race to watch here, but I think it's fairly likely that the Republican will win here by a likely margin. Texas, I think Beto O'Rourke's out of it. Pretty much every poll shows him down by a likely margin. Some even show him down by a safe margin. However, I do think Beto usually is known, especially in the 2018 Senate race. He definitely exceeded expectations, which is why I'm keeping it in the likely column, but he's still going to lose. With Brian Kemp in Georgia, he's pretty much going to beat Stacey Abrams, and he's probably going to beat her by about 8 to 9 points. He's just winning all those moderate independents, all because he opposed Trump in trying to overturn the election in Georgia. He pretty much refused to do it, and independents are rewarding him with that. In Colorado, the Republican candidate here is pretty much a joke. It's not going to be a competitive race. Democrats are easily going to win here by probably over 10% for sure, and probably up to 14%, I'd say, for the margin of victory. All right, let's go to New England really quick. Maine, most polls show it within a likely range. However, polling can miss in Maine, but I do think Mills is going to win here by a likely margin, probably around 8 points, I would say, against her Republican opponent. In Connecticut, I think the Democrat here is going to win by over 10%. He's a fairly popular governor in the approval polls I've seen, and the Republican is probably one of the best they could get here, but he's still going to lose by over 10% because that's what most of the polls have been saying. I don't think it's going to be a likely race. I think it's going to be one of the fairly easier races to predict. Rhode Island, there's not a lot of polling here, and Some of the polls don't even show the Democrat clearing over 50%, and most of them show them up by over 10. However, there's a lot of undecideds, and this is a race to keep an eye on. Republicans may have the ability to pull off an upset here because there hasn't been a lot of attention placed on Rhode Island, but I still think the Democrat here, I think his name is Dan Malloy, he's pretty favored to win still, but it could be a potential upset for Republicans if they have a really good night. In New York, I think Lee Zeldin's going to be heading to an 8-point defeat. With the way New York counts their ballots, though, we could expect to see it may be possible that Lee Zeldin's leading at first in New York for a day or two, but then that's quickly going to get drawn out by the mail-in ballots, which are counted, the absentee and mail-in ballots, which are counted like a couple days later or a day later. Sometimes they be counted the same night, but most of the time it's counted days later in New York. So we're going to be seeing pretty much a blue shift after the election day votes are counted in New York. So there's a lot of competitive House races that are going to take days to be called. And if Lee Zeldin's leading at first, I don't expect him to win still. There's going to be a lot of mail-in ballots that are going to overwhelm his lead and just pretty much prevent him from winning. I still think it's a likely Democratic race. But I do have to say, Zeldin's ground game in this state, I'm definitely saying it because this is my home state. I see a lot of Zeldin signs here, which is why I think it's going to be a likely race at this point. But there's something going on in New York, and it's probably going to be a likely race. That's all I have to comment on that. Okay, in Pennsylvania, I think it's fairly certain Mastriano's going to lose. Republicans pretty much gave up at propping up his flailing campaign. I mean, now he's getting painted as an anti-Semite, which he kind of is, honestly. He's a very far-right candidate. He's a pretty crappy one for the state of Pennsylvania, and that's why Josh Shapiro is easily going to win here, thus giving Democrats 12 years of governor control in the state of Pennsylvania just because of how terrible Mastriano's campaign is. He's a garbage tier candidate. Probably one of the worst this cycle, honestly, especially in the gubernatorial races. In Minnesota, talking about bad candidates, I mean, Jensen, very weak. He's probably going to lose by about 6 to 7 points. Surprisingly, he's not losing by like a solid Democratic margin, but that's just because 2022 is probably going to be a red-leaning year. So the national environment's keeping him in contention as to maybe win. Even in the worst-case scenario, I think Minnesota's only lean Democratic. That's if Democratic voter turnout isn't that big, but I still think it's going to be fairly large in the state of Minnesota, so Democrats going to win the state by a likely margin, I would say. Okay, which state should we go to next? Let's finish off the Rust Belt. Michigan, I think Tudor Dixon's going to lose here just by about 4.5%, almost a likely margin for Governor Whitmer in this state. Tudor Dixon was just a very weak Republican candidate, and it's only now that the GOP is deciding to funnel money into this race. It's pretty much too little too late. If they decided to put more funds in this race earlier on, Whitmer could probably only win by 3 points or 2 points. It could have been a more competitive race, but they saw a lot of weakness in Tudor Dixon's campaign, and they're put most of their funds early on elsewhere, which is honestly probably a smarter move. I don't really think that's a winnable race for Dixon, considering how weak of a candidate she is. In the state of Wisconsin, I mean, it's going to be definitely one of the toss-up races, but I think it's still going to be Republican-leaning just because of how much Mandela's Barnes campaign collapsed here. He's going to be dragging Tony Evers pretty much to the grave with him, basically. But it's still going to be one of the most competitive governor elections this year. Keep an eye on Wisconsin. If Democrats are winning it, that means they're having a good night in terms of the 2022 midterms. They're having a good night in the governor elections, which is pretty good for them. So keep an eye on this state, but I think Republicans are favored to win it. The state of New Mexico, before I had it as a likely state, now I'm putting as lean. I think the Democrat here is still going to win by about 4% against Mark Ronchetti. He did make the Senate race in 2020 a lot more competitive than expected. So, in some polls, they still have him up. Oh, they still have the Democrat up here on average by a likely margin, but I'm expecting it to narrow in the coming days. So, I think the Democrats still going to win here by a lean margin, basically. Kari Lake in Arizona is probably going to win by about 2% just because Katie Hobbs didn't want to debate her. It's that simple. Hobbs is way too timid in not wanting the debate, and voters see that, which is why Kari Lake is beating her in a very winnable race for Democrats. They kind of blown it with Katie Hobbs refusing the debate. Even if she just did a little bit worse than Kari Lake, this could have been only a tilt Republican state for her, but now it's lean. And these last three states here are going to be the most competitive ones. Same boxes Wisconsin's in already. So in Nevada, the early voting numbers aren't looking the best for Democrats here. So I think the Republican Lombardo is favored. Plus, I think Lombardo is going to do slightly better than Laxalt, just by like 0.5%. Not really that big of a difference, honestly. And in Oregon and Kansas, Kansas still has not have a poll in like 20 to 30 days. So we really have no idea what's going on here. We just have to assume things at this point based on the other polling. There's a lot of undecideds. The Kansas Democratic governor isn't super unpopular. I think she's generally well approved of by like 5% around there, positively. So it's pretty much a coin toss. We have no idea what's going on in this state. We just know that there's a Republican candidate, a Democratic one, and there's a right-leaning independent candidate that's sucking votes away from Republicans in the state, which is why I think the incumbent Democrat will have a bit of an edge against her Republican opponent. Okay. So the state of Oregon. Currently the polls have it as tilting Republican. However, you do have to anticipate that some Betsy Johnson supporters who may be more left-leaning, which I think they are, may be reluctant and notice that the independent candidate, Betsy Johnson, really isn't looking like she has a chance at winning here. So I do think there'll be a bit of a drift from support, especially we've seen this in the general election. We've seen third-party candidates have a lot of points, more than expected before, but then the election happens and people switch their votes all the time in the voting booth. They change their minds. They realize, do I really want to risk a Republican or Democrat at winning victory in this state just because I want to vote for an independent? So I do think a lot of Betsy Johnson voters are probably going to switch back to the Democrat last second. So that's my election prediction so far. I think the Republicans will win 28 governorships to the Democrats 22 governorships. Let me know what you think of this video in the comments below. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.